right, good afternoon, everybody. This is Rabbi Kulikowski, the Koblenzer Rov, just answering questions from a website called Quora.org or Quora.com. I don't know. I'll tell you time and time again, I really don't like this website, but it still pulls me in. And this is a good question. Muhammad Saiful Alam Sadiki asked a very good and simple question, but a basic question that a lot of people are not really familiar with the answer to, including in the Jewish community. And the question is, why do we recite the Kiddush on Shabbat, on Shabbos? Why do we recite a blessing of sanctification of the Sabbath? The answer is as follows. As we've explained in many of our videos, the Jewish religion is based in the Scripture, what Christians would call the Old Testament. However, as I've said many times, when it comes to many different religious traditions that base themselves on these same scriptural texts, we all come to different conclusions of how to interpret these texts. In the Jewish tradition, we have a very strong oral tradition, known as often as the rabbinical tradition, that explains how we as Jews interpret Scripture and how we put Scripture into practice. And we believe that, to a certain extent, that these traditions were handed down already from the time of Moses, and they were given by God to Moses, not just what's written in the text, but the oral traditions as well. Whether it means that the actual laws that we have today were originally given to Moses, certain ones we certainly believe were, what we call Halacha L'Moshe Sinai, that is in Orthodox Judaism is universally recognized as something that was given to Moses at Sinai by God, but then, that's not written in Scripture. But then we have other ways that we have traditional ways of interpreting Scripture. And so when it comes to these things, we could say perhaps we're fulfilling excuse me, scriptural mandate by virtue of these practices and these traditions that we have. Whether they were rabbinical inventions really doesn't make a difference, because Scripture tells us to follow the teachings of the judges and so forth, and not to deviate from what they teach. And so therefore, when a duly recognized court made a law, made a ruling that this is the way we do things, that becomes the obligation, and it's really the fulfillment of the biblical obligation. Even though it might have been a rabbinical invention to begin with, but the way it exists today, it is how we practice our faith, and that's the way we do it, because we have, the authority that was God-given and is given in Scripture. So when it comes to this question of Kiddush, why do we recite the Kiddush? So the answer is as follows. In the Ten Commandments it says, Zocher es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsho. Remember the Sabbath day to sanctify it. In other words, to make it holy. And the sages explain in the oral tradition that we have, it says, Kitshuhu b'dvarim h'nemorim al hayayim, that we sanctify the Sabbath through words, and the words are recited upon the wine, meaning while we are holding a cup of wine, we recite these words, and then we drink the wine. That's how we fulfill the commandment, although it couldn't be enough just to hear it and just one person drink the wine. Not everybody has to drink the wine. But before we eat on the Sabbath, Friday night, or if we didn't eat Friday night for some reason, this would also be Shabbos morning. What we do is we hold a cup of wine or grape juice, and we recite the blessing. First the blessing for the grape juice, and then the blessing for the Sabbath that ends with the words Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh HaShabbat, or Mekadesh HaShabbos. Blessed art thou, O Lord, who sanctifies the Sabbath. And so therefore we recognize that God is the one who sanctified this day, as Scripture testifies elsewhere. And we thereby fulfill the commandment, which is part of the Ten Commandments, that the commandment of remembering the Sabbath includes sanctifying it, that we have to sanctify the Sabbath with words, by declaring it as something that's sanctified by God. And the tradition that we were given is we should do that while holding a cup of wine. And subsequently someone should drink that wine or grape juice. If one does not have access to wine or grape juice on Friday night, the tradition we have is that one could instead recite the blessing over bread, meaning that we hold the bread, we wash our hands first and recite the blessing for washing the hands that was instituted in the time of King Solomon. We recite the blessing for the bread, Hamotzi Lechem Min Haaretz, and then that bracha of Kiddush, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kidshanu mitzvosav v'etzavanu v'chulu, that ends Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh HaShabbos, which ends with Blessed art thou, O Lord, who sanctifies the Sabbath, just as we would recite it if we were holding the wine. Even though our sages say that it's ideal to recite it over wine, we can do it over bread if we do not have access to wine. Incidentally, many of the rabbinical authorities teach that actually when we recite our liturgy, which has the words Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh HaShabbos, we've actually, blessed art thou, O Lord, who sanctifies the Sabbath, we've actually fulfilled our biblical mandate of sanctifying the Sabbath with words. And so then at that point, after we've recited the evening prayer, which we always do before we come home and recite the Kiddush obligation is thereby a rabbinical obligation, or it could be a continuation of that biblical obligation. But essentially, it's a rabbinical obligation. But nonetheless, as we said, Scripture tells us to not deviate from that which they teach you left or right. Now, there is two more aspects of the Kiddush. One that we call Kiddush, we call Kiddush Rabbah. That is, on the morning of the Sabbath, and the holidays as well, before we eat, after we've said our prayers, before we eat, again we make Kiddush. And generally, like Friday night, we do recite Bible verses before we recite the Kiddush. On Friday night, we say Vayechulu from Genesis 2. And on Shabbos morning, we recite other verses from Exodus, and different communities might recite other verses as well. But the actual Kiddush is simply Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam borei pri hagafen. We do not have the bracha of Mekadesh HaShabbos. We do have it in the morning liturgy, in the prayer, but not in the morning Kiddush. And that Kiddush, according to everyone, is a rabbinical obligation, but that's why we call it Kiddush Rabbah, because really, rabbinical law is on a higher level in certain ways than biblical law. It's as if that we could say like this, that if the biblical law, Scripture is a love letter that God gave to us, and the rabbinical law is a love letter that we give back to God. And also because people tend to take rabbinical law less seriously, which they should not do, for that reason we strengthen it. Now, with that being said, since it's a bracha over a beverage before we eat on Shabbos, we cannot, and there is no bracha of Mekadesh HaShabbos, we cannot recite the morning Kiddush, what we call Kiddush Rabbah, over bread. So if one does not have grape juice or wine available for the Shabbos morning Kiddush, or even if one likes something else and they have grape juice or wine available, but maybe they might not have enough for Havdalah or different issues like that, or even they have but they just prefer this, one may recite the Shabbos morning Kiddush on another drink, in which case instead of Berei Pri Hagafen you would say the bracha Shahakol Niyad B'Dvaro that we say on other foods and drinks that don't have a special bracha, that all was made by His word. Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, the King of the universe, that all was made by His word. Now, when it comes to this aspect, and then after that we would eat the bread. We'd wash our hands and eat bread, or if one would prefer, they could have cake first and then have bread later. Although generally in my home and many other places, it's according to the custom of Vilna Gaon and others, that one would recite the Kiddush again at home, even if one recited it in the synagogue or heard it in the synagogue. And again, you only have to hear it be recited. You don't actually have to drink the wine or the grape juice or the other beverage. It should be noted that that other beverage cannot be water, and it cannot be mostly water. Pretty much any alcoholic beverage generally is understood to be okay, but it's what we call Chamar Medina, the wine of the country. Generally, if it's something that one drinks for enjoyment and not for thirst, so beer or something like that would be fine. There's different discussions whether one could say it on a shot glass of a smaller amount of whiskey or something else. Some allow that, and some say no, it has to be a full cup. Even you could say it on whiskey, but it would have to be a full cup. There's a question about orange juice and apple juice. Generally, my understanding is if you make a cocktail, a mixed drink, something with orange juice and apple juice, and add some alcohol to it, for sure that's fine. And even the orange juice, the apple juice by itself should be fine. Coffee, we generally say if you add milk to coffee, that's if you're not eating meat with right away, or eating meat with it, that should be fine. But when it comes to sodas, there's different opinions. Some people say that yes, soda you could make Kiddush on, that is, like Coca-Cola, whatever, would be the Chamar Medina of America. And others would say, again, since it's mostly water, you would need to add something else. For example, you make a cocktail that has some alcohol in it, that would, or even if it's not the majority, but once you add the alcohol to it, then it for sure becomes the Chamar Medina, and in that way you could make the Kiddush Shabbos morning on some other beverage. But again, it's or if you mix it with a juice or something, there might be questions also. Juice that comes from concentrate, and that's mostly water. And again, there are different opinions on that matter. And a lot of the time it has to do with what situation you find yourself in, what, when, and where. The best is, though, to use wine or perhaps grape juice. Some people frown on using grape juice, but it's generally accepted today that grape juice is okay. Particularly in a case where you have someone who cannot drink alcohol. For whatever reason, whether it's a health reason or something else, or addiction. There's another aspect of the, actually, according to many opinions, the biblical Kiddush of Friday night, and that's Havdalah. That Saturday night after Shabbos ends, we make the bracha of Havdalah also over a cup of wine. Now, in this case, this is interesting because it's the biblical obligation according to many opinions. So it's therefore almost the parentheses of closing with that sanctification of Friday night. That's a biblical obligation, unlike the Shabbos morning. That's clearly a rabbinical obligation. However, although some say Havdalah is rabbinical, however, it is similar to the morning Kiddush in the fact that we do not use bread for Havdalah, but we can use Chamar Medina. If one does not have access to wine or grape juice, they can use some other beverage, that the same type of beverage that would be used for Shabbos morning, could also be used for Havdalah. And just, again, instead of saying Grey Prigofen, you say Shahakol. The question is, there's a third meal that we eat on Shabbos. Do we make Kiddush at the third meal? The general custom is not to make Kiddush, although in some communities they do. And in certain other communities, even if they're not making Kiddush, they might still partake of a little bit of wine or grape juice to make the bracha, just to have an extra bracha to say. And personally, that's what I do, meaning what I'll generally do is after I eat the fish, the l'chaim that I'll have by Shalosh Seudos will be on grape juice or wine. So this way, make the Brei Prigofen, but you don't say l'chaim on Kiddush according to Ashkenazic tradition. The Sephardim do, and that's pretty much so the Shalosh Seudos bracha Brei Prigofen would thereby be the l'chaim. That was the minig of the Samarav, whereas the other tzaddikim actually made it more in the form of Kiddush, more similar to the Shabbos morning Kiddush, but again, generally would be in the middle of the meal and not before washing for the meal. And there's different approaches how one approaches that question. And many people don't do it at all, don't have any grape juice or wine during Shalosh Seudos, and everyone can follow their own minhag in that area. So thank you for watching. God bless. Please like, share, and subscribe, comment, and we'll see you all later. Thank you. And thank you for the good question, Mohammed. God bless.